The body. The human body is both amazingly beautiful and ingeniously designed. And we're rarely aware or pause to notice how incredible it is, or to experience the feats that it can achieve. We only tend to notice our bodies when they're not working properly, when the virus lays us out flat, or when we break a bone, or get a terrible paper cut. I mean, how often are you aware of the way that your heart continuously beats and circulates blood throughout your body, over 1,000 times a day? And when was the last time you took time to think about your lungs, constantly sucking in delicious, sweet oxygen and blowing out carbon dioxide? It's amazing, but when we look in the mirror, when we pause to look in the mirror, our attention tends to be on the things that are out of place, that one hair sticking up, or perhaps they're gray and thinning hair, in my case, or the wrinkle spots, the wrinkles and age spots. Where do they come from? The mirror, however, shows just how amazing our bodies are, right? When you really look in the mirror, we see such amazing things. The same thing happens, I think, in today's reading from the Hebrew Bible. God gave the people the 10 Commandments to serve as a mirror, to reflect back to them who they were, the image that they carried, God's own image, beautiful, perfect, wonderfully designed. And the people failed to comprehend that mirror and the 10 Commandments for what they were. Like our own bodies, they only noticed the 10 Commandments when they ended up breaking them or limiting them. Instead of allowing the mirror of the 10 Commandments to reflect back the beauty that they were created to show, we have generally come to appreciate them primarily as a list of what we can't do. In reality, they were given as wisdom to help us live a life that was unfettered and peaceful. And so instead of letting them highlight the beauty that God created in us, we've turned them into some onerous system of do's and don'ts. Thou shalt not, we tend to think of them only. Sadly, I think that's what religion often does. Create a cultic system that distracts us from paying attention to the truly wondrous things already in our midst, including our bodies. I have to wonder if that isn't why Jesus cleared the temple in the gospel reading this morning. We're familiar with this story. It's in all 4 Gospels, Jesus cleansing the temple. But I wonder if its familiarity prompted us to stop paying attention. For John uses this story quite differently than the other gospel writers. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus' cleansing of the temple comes much later in his story and in his ministry, just after his triumphal entry, which we remember on Palm Sunday, into Jerusalem. And indeed, it serves as the last straw that drives his opponents to conclude that there's only one way to deal with this upstart rabbi who's threatening the primacy of the temple and their precarious relationship with Rome. He must be done away with. In John, however, the story's right at the very beginning of his ministry. It serves as one of his first acts, with Jesus going public with the first century equivalent of an activist performance art, driving everything and everyone out of the temple, overturning the tables of the money changers as well. Also in John, Jesus does not accuse his opponents of turning the Lord's house of prayer into a den of robbers, suggesting that the main problem was defrauding the poor, corruption of the temple leaders, in collusion with the Romans. No, in John's gospel, Jesus simply says, "Stop making my Father's house a marketplace." Now, this is kind of confusing because this is what the temple was designed for, to exchange money for animals that one would slaughter, for the sacrificial law. That's why it exists. So what's going on here? Why is Jesus disrupting the normal order of things? I think it's because Jesus is drawing our attention back to the very foundation of our human story, our bodies. Speaking first about his own body, his physical incarnation, his life, death, resurrection, and ascension, and the gift of the Holy Spirit, he calls us to understand that our flesh, human flesh, is sufficient to mediate God's grace and love and mercy. Jesus is the one who introduces us to this parental heart of God, the one who makes the unknowable God knowable and approachable, and puts skin on the matter, leading us into this place of great intimacy, like only bodies can communicate. First with his own body, and then by inviting us to become part of his body, and still today with our own bodies. Speaking of bodies, let me invite you to notice your own body in this moment. Notice the weight of it. Notice the pew that's holding up your weight, your feet on the floor, providing grounding and support. Do you happen to notice any tension or tightness in your body? Maybe in your neck or your shoulders? Just breathe and notice. For it is our bodies that allow us to awaken to God's presence, not just out there or here, but in here. Now, I happen to think that the point of John's placement of this story is to share some shocking news with us. What if Jesus is clearing out the temple as another moment where God is deciding to hold up the mirror and invite us to see beyond our normal, comfortable systems of encountering God? You see, I think that we set up religious systems as much to keep God at bay as to encounter God. We create church buildings and temples to locate God in a certain place so that we may go there and find God. And also so we can keep God there, keep him safe, away from the rest of our concerns and worries. We know where to find him when we need him. I think it's been one of the difficult learnings of this pandemic when we were cut off from our sanctuaries, places we could go to find connection to God. Where do we find God then? How can we find God's living presence in our midst if we can't go to see God? And we forget, of course, that God is everywhere, that God is even in our bodies. But we're scared. We're scared to admit that fact. We don't want God too close. Indeed, if you were to read the next few verses after the Ten Commandments story from the Hebrew Bible, this is what you'd find. When all the people witnessed the thunder and the lightning, the sound of the trumpet and the mountain smoking, they were afraid and trembled and stood at a distance. This is before social distancing, just to be known. And said to Moses, "You speak to us, and we will listen. But do not let God speak to us, or we'll die." Moses said to the people, "Do not be afraid, for God has come only to test you and to put the fear of him upon you, so that you do not sin." And then the people stood back at a distance, and we're still standing back at a distance. When God saw that the mirror of the Ten Commandments was failing us, that we weren't using it properly, God donned our own flesh to show us how important our bodies are for encountering the holy, whether that's out in a forest or in a church. What if, in clearing the temple, Jesus is breaking our own mirror that only tends to see our limitations, like those 10 Commandments? The mirror that sees the gray hair and the age spots and the wrinkles, instead of seeing what God sees when God sees us. What if Jesus is totally clearing the deck and inviting us into a new space, a new type of looking? What if he's inviting us to find God in our own bodies, in the bodies of our loved ones and our neighbors? If we now find that God continues to live in human flesh, and through the wonder of our own beating hearts and breathing lungs, how then are we to think about our own bodies? And how might we reconsider our relationship with God? I'm sad to say the truth is, we're not very comfortable with our own bodies. Most of us don't live in our own skin all that well. We feel the pull of society to make us be something that we already are. And I think one of the reasons we're not comfortable in our own bodies is because we're not comfortable with God. We're desperately seeking to find a deeper sense of belonging and acceptance. But we just are afraid of being vulnerable, afraid of being seen, I think. We need to give ourselves permission to belong first to ourselves in our bodies, to be okay with ourselves in our bodies, and then we can find that we belong to God all along. The two are connected. We'll find a deeper sense of peace living in our own bodies when we realize the desire to belong is a deeply spiritual emotion. I was reminded of all this on Friday, on a clergy day, via Zoom. Not my idea of a great way of spending a day, 6.5 hours on Zoom. It was a lot, but there was one small group exercise that the presenter led us in that really struck me. In a group of 3 other clergy, we were invited to complete this sentence. When I am experiencing my life and myself as sacred, I ... When I'm experiencing my life and myself as sacred, I... How would you complete that sentence? What does it mean for you to feel sacred, your own body as sacred? In my small group, we each came up with several different ways to complete that sentence. It was the answer that first popped into my mind, however, that I think is perhaps the truest for me. When I'm experiencing my life and myself as sacred, I'm naked and vulnerable. Since discovering a prayer prompt, and perhaps a dare, from the Episcopal priest and writer Barbara Brown Taylor, to spend a few minutes looking at yourself naked in the bathroom mirror and allowing yourself to be seen as God sees you, I've become aware of the sacredness of my own body. Our bodies belong to us, and they're a promise that we belong to God. In her book, Braving the Wilderness, Brene Brown defines belonging as this: belonging is the deeply held belief that we are inextricably connected to each other by something greater than us. And that thing that is greater than us is rooted in love and compassion. And that we're connected to each other in a way that cannot be severed. We are all connected to each other in deep human ways, even when we don't pay attention, even when we're not noticing. And I would contend that the thing that is greater than us is God. Not that transcendent God of thunder and smoke and lightning in the Hebrew Bible that lives far off from our worries and anxieties, but the God who knows and loves us in our own flesh, with our own flesh. And yet, we have a difficult time seeing it or experiencing God in this way, intimately, as a lover, as a friend, as a competitor and companion that plays with us. Why? Because we're too busy trying to fit in, that we've forgotten how to belong to our bodies and how to belong to God. Yes, our fear of being alone and going it alone masks the hidden connection that links us all together. We're willing to sacrifice everything, including our sense of belonging, just to feel connected for a few brief, fleeting moments. Brene Brown shares the quote from Maya Angelou and uses it as a rallying cry for all of us to belong. Angelou writes, "You are only free when you realize that you belong no place. You belong every place, no place at all. The price is high, the reward is great." The truth is that in Lent, we often talk about being out in the wilderness, And as a people, I think we are in the wilderness. Like the ancient Hebrews of old, we're looking for rules to guide our journey in this life. And in Jesus, God joins us in the wilderness of our lives. God comes to dwell in our flesh, to remind us that it will be our own vulnerable and yet beautiful bodies that serve as the vehicle for connection to ourselves, to one another, and to God. While God's promise to be with us and in us may give us hope, it doesn't change the fact that we're out in the wilderness. And sadly, that's all too apparent these days. We've lost our sense of belonging. We've not been showing up authentically for one another. And these days, we can't even see each other face to face, it seems. We're too fearful to be ourselves, too afraid of offending someone else or being ridiculed to risk just being present in our own bodies. It's time to stop fitting in and start belonging. It's time to experience our lives and our bodies as sacred and holy again. Our bodies are the means for connection. It's the only way we can touch another. It's the only way we can be touched by God. And that takes practice, like anything involving our bodies. We're invited to make our bodies less reactive and more receptive. I think we often walk through life just reacting, not receiving. The Nobel Prize-winning Indian poet Tagore once wrote, "Everything comes to us that belongs to us, if we create the capacity to receive it. Everything comes to us that belongs to us, if we create the capacity to receive it." All the love, the belonging, the purpose comes to us and belongs to us if we create the capacity to receive it. Will you receive God's message today? Will you hear and listen? Lent is a season where we hold up the mirror and we look at ourselves and we see ourselves as God created us, not as broken, messed up people, but as carrying God's own image, the beloved. Will you receive that today? Will you receive God's gift to know that you are beautiful and lovely and delightful? Today's gospel, Jesus smashes the mirror, so we'll stop obsessing with our imperfections and maybe look to each other, creating real connection with someone else, even if they are wearing a mask. We can look into each other's faces and eyes and use those as mirrors to find the proof that God is present with us in our very bodies. Amen.